Hey everybody. We're 10 years out from the release of The Force Awakens and the start of the sequel trilogy. Many years on and a dozen or so projects under their belt. Some successes, some failures, mostly a lot of just kind of mid, like, that's fine, you know. And it's become clear to me, looking at the future of Star Wars and kind of where things are going, that I don't know if Disney's learned the right lessons as to why their run has not been as successful as they'd like. In order to understand that, you have to think of a few things, and you got to kind of time travel back for context. See, while those of us who love Star Wars have been steeped in it for decades, gobbling up any new bit of lore and what have you, Disney and the people who run Disney essentially have a view and an understanding of Star Wars and the Star Wars universe that people who in 1992 were either too busy or too disinterested in Star Wars to pick up the books and really didn't pick up on any kind of Star Wars fandom again until the prequels came out. Because the thing is that, you get to 86 and there was nothing. Yeah, 86, 87, nothing. There's no toys. The comic books ended. The Ewoks and the Droids cartoons, those ended pretty early on. The Ewok movies came and gone, and those were fine for, some, just kind of cheesy, movie, TV movies. They, did a little bit of expanding on things, That's where you get actual, like, witches, things like that. So it doesn't, they do some interesting things, but, it isn't capital S, capital W Star Wars. They're little side stories that are interesting, but they're connected very tenuously at best. I mean, you swap out the Ewoks and it can be any kind of property. But this stuff had all come and gone, and there was nothing. And so a lot of people, and a lot of us Star Wars fans moved on, like this was done. We would rent the originals from the video store when we felt like watching them. Maybe we had some, discussions with friends about how we wished that George would do, 1, 2, 3, 7, 8, 9, because we all knew that they were supposed to be those. But he had just had enough and he was kind of done and wanted to move on himself. And we were like, okay, fine, all right. It's a bummer, but, okay. So, we moved on to Star Trek. We moved on to other shows and movies. And, I got into horror real big at that time, So, a bunch of us had moved on. But then you get to 1992, I do believe, was when Heir to the Empire comes out. And those of us who were inclined to jump into a book series, during the gap in Star Wars was when I, read a bunch of the classics. That's when I first read the Dune series and fell in love with that universe. And so you get to, the books starting to come out, and we gobbled those up. And even those, which, very, the first, kind of run of books, which came very close to trying to stay kind of in line with kind of the vibe of what people would consider at the time traditional Star Wars. Um, even some of those expanded things in very kind of unique ways, I mean, you get introduced to, you know, force blocking salamanders, you get, introduced to the concept of, cloning and more specifically cloning being used as a tool of the dark side. So you get kind of into these things, the comic books come back. And, that's where the whole Palpatine transferring his soul from clone to clone to achieve some form of immortality is introduced. So Star Wars starts going into kind of weird ways, but they're, a little trepidatious, they aren't going too crazy. But once you get to prequel era and you start moving beyond that, like you start getting into stuff like, you know, the later books, especially, you know, you're basically getting, I mean, you look at Abeloth. And I come back to Abeloth a lot because, especially right now where we're kind of seeing like, oh, they're kind of maybe signaling something here, you know, or you look at, the Mortis gods and the Bindu, and these are, Abeloth is an eldritch god. I mean, that Abeloth is as Lovecraftian horror as you can get in the Star Wars universe. And that brings me to what the lesson that Disney failed to understand or learn is that under George, once he decided to step back in, the universe started to get bigger and bigger and weirder. And that's part of what people loved. Yes, we love the characters. Yes, we love, Anakin and Obi-Wan and Padme and Luke and Leia and Han and Vader and, the Emperor and all of these characters. But what they didn't understand, because they had this mindset of somebody who maybe checked out on Star Wars once it was wrapped up and then only dipped their toe back in when the prequels came out and then jumped back out, is they had this casual fan understanding of the property. They didn't fully understand that what a lot of us who've been there the whole time love about it is the fact that what solidified it and what made it more and more and more of this big cultural touchstone outside of just 3 movies at the time was the fact that it started to expand and it could go in all these weird directions. And they just wrote that off. And while I get from a business standpoint why they wanted to jettison the old EU, that really kind of shows that they didn't understand. They literally thought that fans only really cared about these 6 movies, and 3 of them not so much, because again, to understand why they keep learning the wrong lessons, you have to understand that these guys at Disney, these aren't art people. George Lucas is an art person. That's why he's willing to take something that he knows he might take it in a direction that people might go, oh, I don't know if I like that, like midichlorians. But, he's an art person, so he's willing to take that risk because that's the weird way he wants to expand in that direction. And really, outside of a very large vocal minority, I think most people really like the prequels. I think you just had a bunch of people who were very loud, who had their own expectations worked up in their head. And unfortunately, I mean, even George was susceptible a little bit to those guys. But Disney is so risk averse because they're stock market people. These are stock market people. And so the idea of bringing in like some weird eldritch horror to fight against Luke Skywalker would be the furthest thing from their minds. But George Lucas hears that idea and goes, yeah, let's run with that. That's cool. That's weird. That's a wild idea. Let's run with that. So you get it in the books. Could George Lucas have gone that way? Oh, I think so. I mean, you look at the Bendu. I mean, essentially, the same kind of eldritch god, just a little more benevolent, a little more, I'd say chaotic good than, obviously Abeloth. But, Disney would never. And I know we all think that that's where Ahsoka Season 2 is, but now there's all this concern about Ahsoka Season 2 because it was pulled off of the 2026 schedule. Now, I'm hoping that's just because of production delays. But, you look at their gross misunderstanding of the search for Ben Solo and their reasoning for not moving forward with that. And it goes to show that fundamental misunderstanding. You look at the script for Duel of the Fates, and it starts out with an eldritch horror. It starts out, Tor Valum is an eldritch horror. It's this crazy Lovecraftian creature who is this just entity of the dark side. And they chickened out. They balked. And what did they do? Well, we'll just make it kind of like Return of the Jedi. No. That's not what fans really wanted. That's what a bunch of vocal trolls and rage baiters on the damn internet wanted. And you gave it to them. And did they like it? No, they didn't. And you undercut the rest of your trilogy by doing so. So they have never learned the right lesson as to what actual Star Wars fans want. Had they had the balls and the spine to do George's original treatments, yeah, it would have gone in weird ways. I guarantee it. It would have expanded the universe in all sorts of weird directions. And maybe you would have had the same vocal people who, oh, the prequels suck, would have said the same thing about these. But they were going to say that anyway. You can't listen to people who make their whole identity hating on whatever the new Star Wars thing is, hating whatever the new Marvel thing is. You can't base your art on that, because you're going to create compromised stuff every time. So, we'll see. I mean, if Ahsoka Season 2 comes out and we do get Abeloth and it does get into, Mortis God territory and getting all into this weird, expansive, esoteric stuff where we think it's going, then, hey, maybe they finally learned. If they start bringing in back to canon, whether it's via the video games, obviously we're getting Fate of the Old Republic, which should, assuming they aren't still releasing the remakes, but that should be a vehicle to start recanonizing some fan favorite characters, Revan, Malak, Nihilus, I mean, Nihilus is as Lovecraftian as it gets without being, you know, some giant monster, you know, but he's as Lovecraftian as it gets. Bring that in, you know, once you know, that the Fate of the Old Republic should be able to bring all of that back in, should be able to bring in some of the weird stuff out of the Old Republic, you know. Let's see Star Wars get back to where it was before you guys bought it, neutered it, and mushed it into this amalgam of only what you know, calls back to the original trilogy. You know, and we see them dipping their toe more and more into, you know, stuff that was in the prequels, but like, guys, you gotta start, you gotta look at where we were at the time that you bought it. Star Wars fans were going along for the ride. We were going where they were taking us, where George was taking us, where he was, you know, okaying the expanded universe people to take us, which was starting to take us in really weird places. A lot of weird esoteric things, a lot of weird Lovecraftian things. You know, you got to get back to that point. You have to start expanding it, not shrinking it. So we'll see what they do. My hope is that they've learned the right lesson, maybe. And we'll see. You know, I think Ahsoka Season 2 is going to be the real big tell. If it gets canceled and we don't get into, you know, the Mortis God territory, Abeloth, all of that weirdness, then, you know, and we just get Starfighter and Mandalorian and Grogu, and it's all this callback stuff, then I don't know. But you know, I think Ahsoka is our best hope in Season 2 to expand in that weird George Lucas, let's get a little crazy with it way. So, we'll see. You know, we're in kind of a weird gray area with Star Wars right now where we really don't know what they're going to do. So, here's hoping for the best. Let me know in the comments below what you think, and see you in the next video.